The Great Plains stretch endlessly across the heart of North America, their open skies meeting the horizon in a line so vast and unbroken that it almost invites the imagination to wander. For many, this land has become a symbol of promise, resilience, and survival. Yet for the pioneers who ventured westward during the 19th century, the Great Plains represented far more than open opportunity. To them, it was a place of both hope and hardship, a land that tested every ounce of endurance they possessed. When we think of the pioneer journey, it is often remembered through images of covered wagons, open prairies, and families seeking a new life. But behind those images lies a quieter, more sobering truth: winter. For settlers on the Great Plains, the warm months were spent in preparation, while the long winters were endured in silence and determination. The harsh season was not merely a part of life, it was the ultimate test of survival. This documentary will gently explore how these men, women, and children survived the bitter cold, the snowstorms, and the endless nights of the western frontier. Our journey tonight will not be hurried. Instead, it will unfold slowly, much like the creeping chill of a winter's night on the prairie. As we settle into the story, the rhythm of history will guide us, steady and calm, carrying us across landscapes of memory where survival was the central theme. The importance of understanding these winters lies not in the drama of suffering, but in the quiet perseverance of ordinary people. Each family who braved the frontier carried with them a story of endurance. They were not conquerors of the land but caretakers of fragile hope, bending with the winds yet refusing to break. Their story is not one of grand battles or sweeping political events. Rather, it is a story written in small acts of survival: lighting a fire, sewing a garment, storing food, comforting a child on a stormy night. To grasp the experience of these settlers, we must first imagine the sensory world they inhabited. Picture, if you will, a sod house, its walls made of earth, its roof low and heavy with snow. Outside, the prairie stretches endlessly, silent except for the sharp whistle of the wind. Inside, a dim fire burns, casting shadows that flicker on rough-hewn walls. The family sits close, wrapped in layers of wool and patched fabric, waiting for morning, waiting for spring, waiting for the promise that survival brings. For the pioneers, winter was never a single event, but rather a long season of challenges. Food grew scarce. Travel became dangerous. Illnesses spread easily in close quarters. And yet, there was also routine, ritual, and rhythm. The monotony of cold days and longer nights gave rise to habits of storytelling, prayer, and the small comforts that helped carry them through. These quiet details, often overlooked, form the fabric of survival itself. As we begin our exploration, let us remember that the Great Plains winters were not merely obstacles, but defining experiences. They shaped communities, forged resilience, and tested faith. In many ways, they served as the backdrop against which the pioneer spirit was truly revealed. Without these winters, the history of the American West would tell a different tale, one lacking the quiet strength that hardship so often produces. In this introduction, we set the stage for what is to come. Over the next chapters, we will walk slowly through the world of the pioneers, how they prepared, how they endured, and how they emerged into spring once more. We will trace the rhythms of their lives, always with a gentle pace, always with the understanding that their story is not one of fast victories, but of patient endurance. The question before us is simple yet profound: how did pioneers survive the harsh winters on the Great Plains? The answer unfolds not in sudden revelations, but in a gradual layering of details, much like snow covering the earth. To listen to this story is to hear the quiet echoes of lives lived long ago, in homes small and humble, yet filled with courage. So let us begin. Let us step back into the windswept plains, into the sod houses and frozen rivers, into the world of families who faced each winter not as a passing season, but as a test of spirit. Their lives, though distant, remind us of the enduring strength of humanity, the ability to find warmth in cold, and hope in the endless silence of snow. The story of the pioneers does not begin with winter. It begins with a dream. For countless families in the 19th century, the West shimmered on the horizon like a promise of freedom, of opportunity, and of land that stretched as far as the eye could see. From crowded towns in the East, where land was scarce and work was uncertain, the Great Plains represented a new beginning, wide and open. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent, carried with it a sense of inevitability. Newspapers and pamphlets described fertile soils waiting to be tilled, rivers that promised water for crops, and skies that promised sunshine for harvests. Word spread through villages and city streets alike, and soon the thought of moving west was no longer a distant idea but a possibility to be seized. Families gathered around small tables, discussing what it might mean to leave behind everything familiar: the towns of their birth, the graves of their ancestors, and the comforts of community. For some, it was a painful choice made necessary by poverty. For others, it was an act of boldness, a step into the unknown in search of prosperity. In either case, the journey was marked by hope, and it was this hope that lit the path westward. The Homestead Act of 1862 added fuel to the dream. By promising settlers land if they would farm it, the government invited thousands to stake their claim. Suddenly, the horizon was not only an image of freedom but also a tangible offer. For families who had little more than determination, this was enough. They sold what they owned, packed wagons, and began the long migration to the Great Plains. But what was it that they expected to find? To many, the West was described in glowing terms: endless acres of rich soil, herds of game for hunting, skies that seemed always bright. The images painted were idyllic, almost pastoral, designed to stir the imagination and silence the fear of the unknown. And yet, those who made the journey soon discovered that reality was far more complicated. The land was indeed vast, but it was also unforgiving. Still, in those early days of decision, the hardships were not yet visible. Instead, there was excitement. Imagine a young couple in the 1860s, preparing for the move west. Their wagon creaks under the weight of supplies: tools for farming, crates of seed, blankets, and cooking pots. They wave goodbye to neighbors, hearts filled with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. Ahead lies a future they cannot yet see, but one they believe will reward their courage. The children, too, were carried by the thrill of adventure. To their young eyes, the open prairie seemed an endless playground. The idea of building a home on new soil was not a burden but a grand adventure. Their laughter echoed through the wagons, unaware of the storms that would one day quiet their joy. At first, even the hardships of the journey were softened by hope. The long trails, the weariness of travel, the uncertainty of finding the right piece of land, all were endured with the thought that soon, a farm would rise where none had stood before. The pioneers did not imagine winters as they prepared for their journey. They thought of spring planting, of autumn harvests, of golden fields waving in the wind. The harsh cold, the endless snow, the biting wind, these were not part of the dream. And yet, even as settlers arrived and built their first homes, whispers of challenge were never far away. Letters sent back east sometimes told of unexpected struggles: grasshopper plagues, failed crops, illnesses, and storms. But to those who had already decided to go west, such warnings rarely discouraged. The dream was too strong, too deeply rooted in the desire for something better. The call of the West, then, was not just about land. It was about identity. To be a pioneer was to believe in the possibility of shaping one's own destiny. It was to accept risk as the price of freedom, and to carry hope even into uncertainty. For many, this meant embracing the land fully, whatever it might bring. What they did not yet know, what they could not yet imagine, was how the winters of the Great Plains would become their greatest challenge. The very horizon that had seemed so welcoming would transform into a white expanse of snow, stretching unbroken and unforgiving. The fertile soil would harden into frozen earth, and the skies that once promised sunshine would now release storms of ice. But in this early stage of the journey, the future remained hidden. The call of the West was still a song of promise, and families followed it faithfully. Their wagons rolled across the prairies, their hearts fixed on hope, their eyes lifted to the horizon. They were not yet survivors of winters. They were dreamers answering the call of a land that beckoned them forward. As we leave this chapter, we carry with us their sense of anticipation. For only by understanding the dream that brought them to the Great Plains can we truly grasp the contrast of what awaited them there. Hope gave them the courage to arrive. Survival would give them the strength to remain. The Great Plains stretch like an ocean of grass across the center of North America, a region so expansive that to those who first encountered it, the land seemed without end. From the Canadian prairies in the north to Texas in the south, the plains formed a nearly unbroken sweep of open country. For pioneers who had grown up among hills, forests, or crowded villages, this was a new and unfamiliar world, one defined not by trees or rivers but by wind, sky, and distance. At first glance, the plains seemed to promise abundance. The soil was rich in places, the grass grew tall, and wild game moved freely across the open country. But beneath this promise lay difficulties that would soon reveal themselves. The very features that made the plains vast and beautiful also made them unforgiving, especially when winter arrived. The climate of the Great Plains was one of extremes. Summers could be intensely hot, with the sun baking the soil and drying the grass until it crumbled beneath one's feet. But winters brought the opposite: Cold so sharp it seemed to cut through layers of clothing, snowstorms that swallowed the horizon, and winds that howled across the land with nothing to break their force. There were no mountains to shield settlers, no forests to soften the storms. The prairie lay exposed, and those who lived upon it felt the full weight of nature's power. Blizzards were among the greatest dangers. A storm could appear with little warning, turning a clear day into a white void. Snow would whip across the plains, driven by fierce winds, blinding anyone who dared step outside. Stories from settlers describe how even walking a few steps away from a sod house could become deadly, as the swirling snow erased all sense of direction. Many learned to tie ropes between their homes and their barns so they could find their way during storms, for without such precautions, even the shortest journey could end in tragedy. The winds themselves shaped daily life. They never seemed to rest, sweeping across the plains in steady currents that rattled houses and carried dust or snow for miles. In summer, the wind brought dryness. In winter, it brought piercing cold. Settlers often spoke of the sound of the wind, an endless presence that filled the air both day and night. It was a sound that could comfort but also unsettle, especially when it carried the promise of another storm. The landscape, though beautiful, also presented practical challenges. The lack of trees meant that wood for building and heating was scarce. Families who settled far from rivers or wooded areas had to adapt, constructing homes from sod, blocks of earth cut from the prairie itself. These homes blended into the land, their walls thick enough to hold warmth, though they were often damp and dark. In winter, sod houses offered protection, but they also reminded settlers of just how little the plains gave freely. Water, too, could be uncertain. While rivers and streams existed, their flow was not always reliable, and in the heart of winter, water sources often froze. Families had to break through thick ice to draw water, or melt snow when no other option remained. In times of deep cold, even this simple act became an exhausting task. The animals of the plains adapted in ways that fascinated the settlers. Bison, once numbering in the millions, roamed in herds that endured both summer heat and winter cold. Smaller creatures like prairie dogs and jackrabbits found ways to shelter and survive. For pioneers, these animals were a reminder that survival on the plains was possible, though never easy. Hunting provided food, but it was unpredictable, especially when snow covered the land. Isolation was another feature of the environment that weighed heavily during winter months. The openness of the plains, which seemed so inviting in summer, became a barrier when snow piled high and winds grew fierce. Travel was nearly impossible during storms, and families often went weeks or months without seeing neighbors. This solitude, combined with the long nights of winter, created a sense of loneliness that could be as challenging as the physical hardships. And yet, for all its dangers, the environment of the Great Plains also offered a kind of stark beauty. Settlers often wrote of the sunsets, when the sky blazed with colors over the endless horizon. Winter mornings, too, could be breathtaking, with frost glittering across the grasses and silence stretching in every direction. The very vastness that threatened them also inspired awe, reminding them that they were part of something greater, something both harsh and magnificent. To understand the pioneers' struggle, we must keep in mind that they faced not a single obstacle, but a collection of elements working together: wind, snow, cold, distance, and solitude. Each day of winter brought decisions: when to venture outside, how to conserve fuel, how to keep food from spoiling or freezing, how to comfort children who feared the storms. The environment was relentless, and it required from settlers not only physical endurance but also mental strength. The Great Plains were, in many ways, a land of contradiction. They offered freedom but demanded sacrifice. They gave fertile soil but denied easy shelter. They stretched wide and open, yet they confined families within their homes for months at a time. This balance between promise and peril defined the experience of those who lived there. As the pioneers faced their first winters, they came to understand that survival on the plains was not about conquering the land but about adapting to it. The environment could not be tamed, it could only be endured. In this realization lay the foundation for all that followed, for the preparations they made in autumn, for the strategies they used in winter, and for the relief they felt when spring finally arrived. The Great Plains environment, then, was both teacher and test. It taught patience, resilience, and humility. And it tested every family that dared to settle there, pressing them to their limits with storms, cold, and silence. It was in this environment that the true story of survival unfolded, a story we continue to explore in the chapters that follow. When pioneers first arrived on the Great Plains, their foremost task was to build a place they could call home. The vast openness of the land offered little in the way of ready shelter. There were no stone quarries, few forests for lumber, and little material that resembled what settlers had known in the East. Yet necessity encouraged invention, and the people adapted to the resources around them. The most iconic form of dwelling was the sod house, often called a soddy. These homes were built by cutting blocks of earth, thick with roots, and stacking them into walls. A sod house looked humble, blending almost invisibly into the prairie around it, but its thick walls provided insulation against both summer heat and winter cold. The roofs were often made from more sod, laid over wooden beams when timber could be found, or fashioned with whatever scraps of material were at hand. Inside, the rooms were dark, small, and often damp, but they were also a refuge, proof of a family's determination to create shelter where none had existed. For those who lived near rivers or scattered groves of trees, log cabins were sometimes possible. These resembled the frontier homes of earlier settlements, yet on the Great Plains they were rare luxuries. Timber was precious and not to be wasted. Every piece of wood had value, whether for building, cooking, or heating during the long months of winter. Once shelter was secured, daily life began to take shape. Families settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons. In warmer months, men often worked the land, breaking the thick prairie soil with heavy plows. This was back-breaking labor, for the grasslands were held together by deep root systems that resisted the blade. Women tended gardens, cared for livestock, and managed households. Children, too, played their part, gathering water, helping with chores, or minding younger siblings. Life was communal and demanding, yet also marked by small moments of joy and normality. Food was both a priority and a source of comfort. In summer and autumn, families planted crops, hoping for enough yield to carry them through the year. Corn, beans, and squash were common, along with gardens of hardy vegetables that could be stored or preserved. Meat came from livestock, chickens, pigs, or cattle, or from hunting wild game such as rabbits and deer. Preserving food became a necessary skill. Families dried meat, canned vegetables, or stored produce in root cellars dug into the earth, where temperatures stayed cool. These efforts were not luxuries but lifelines, for when winter came, the land would offer little. The hearth was the heart of daily life. Fires warmed the home, cooked meals, and provided light in the early darkness. Yet keeping a fire alive meant constant effort, and fuel was always scarce. Buffalo chips, dried dung collected from the vast herds that roamed the plains, became a common substitute for wood. Though humble, they burned steadily and kept families warm. Children were often sent to gather these fuels, a reminder that every member of the household contributed to survival. Beyond work, pioneers sought connection and community. Neighbors, though often miles apart, represented lifelines of support. Settlers gathered for barn raisings, quilting bees, or Sunday worship. These events were not simply social, they were acts of survival. A barn raising meant shelter for animals, a quilting bee meant warmth for the coming winter. Yet they also brought laughter, stories, and companionship to lives that could otherwise feel isolated. Religion played a steady role in daily life. Families prayed together, sang hymns, and read from well-worn Bibles. Faith offered guidance and reassurance, especially as the long winters approached. Storytelling, too, filled the evenings, tales of the old country, of journeys west, of family histories passed down by firelight. These stories, gentle and rhythmic, reminded children of who they were and gave adults the comfort of continuity in a world that often felt uncertain. Schooling was another thread in the fabric of settlement. In some communities, neighbors joined together to build small schoolhouses. A single teacher might instruct children of all ages, teaching reading, writing, and arithmetic. For families too far from such schools, parents taught children at home, using whatever books they had carried west. Education was seen as essential, even in the most rugged conditions, for it represented hope for a better future. Illness, however, was an ever-present shadow. With little access to doctors, families relied on home remedies and the knowledge passed down through generations. Herbs, poultices, and simple treatments were all they had. In times of serious sickness, neighbors sometimes rode miles to fetch help, but often it was too late. The isolation of the plains meant that every cold, every fever, every injury carried weight. Survival depended not only on endurance but also on luck. Despite hardships, there was beauty in the daily rhythms of pioneer life. The sight of children playing in the tall grass, the smell of bread baking in a sod oven, the sound of hymns carried softly across the prairie wind, these were moments of peace that gave meaning to the struggle. Settlers found satisfaction in small accomplishments. A roof repaired, a crop harvested, a child's laughter after a day of chores. These fragments of joy were as vital to survival as food or shelter. Before the first snows, life on the Great Plains might almost seem ordinary, even pleasant. Families worked, ate, prayed, and laughed much as they had elsewhere. But always in the background there lingered the knowledge of what was to come. Each meal stored away, each stitch in a quilt, each log stacked near the hearth. These were preparations, quiet acknowledgments of the season ahead. Daily life on the plains, then, was not simply a matter of routine. It was a balance of resilience and hope, of hardship and small triumphs. It was in these early settlements, in sod houses and log cabins, that the foundation was laid for survival. And as autumn faded into winter, the rhythms of daily life gave way to the more pressing rhythms of endurance. For pioneers on the Great Plains, autumn was not simply a season of harvest. It was a race against time, a quiet but urgent effort to gather, repair, and store everything needed to endure the months of bitter cold that lay ahead. Each falling leaf carried a reminder that the prairie would soon turn white, and that only careful preparation stood between a family and disaster. The first priority was food. Families worked tirelessly through late summer and autumn to secure enough provisions to last through winter's grip. Fields of corn were harvested and stored in cribs, their yellow kernels destined to feed both people and livestock. Vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, and turnips were dug from the earth and buried deep in root cellars, where the cool, steady temperature preserved them for months. Beans and peas were dried in bundles, hung in kitchens or stored in sacks, while pumpkins and squash were placed carefully in cool, dark corners where they could endure the cold. Meat required special care. Hunting parties set out to bring down deer or elk before the snow made travel impossible. The meat was smoked, salted, or dried into jerky, ensuring it would not spoil. Families who owned livestock sometimes slaughtered a pig or cow in the fall, dividing the meat into portions for salting or smoking. Nothing was wasted. Bones became broth, fat was rendered into tallow for candles, and hides were tanned for use in clothing or bedding. These labors were not just about food, they were about creating layers of security in a season when every resource mattered. Preservation methods were both practical and ingenious. Glass jars, when available, were used for canning fruits and vegetables, boiled and sealed tightly to last through the winter. In many homes, barrels of salted pork or pickled vegetables stood in corners, their strong smell filling the air. Though simple, these foods became treasures in the dark of January, when the memory of fresh harvests had faded. Fuel was the second necessity. With wood scarce on much of the plains, families gathered whatever they could before the first snow fell. Those who lived near rivers collected driftwood, while others made long trips to groves and returned with wagon loads of logs. For many, however, the most reliable source of fuel was not wood at all, but buffalo chips, dried dung collected from the plains. Children often spent entire days gathering them, filling baskets and sacks, then stacking them neatly near the house. Though humble, buffalo chips burned steadily, producing a gentle heat that kept sod houses warm through the night. Clothing was another form of preparation. Women sewed tirelessly as autumn advanced, patching worn garments and stitching new ones from whatever cloth could be spared. Warmth was the goal, not style. Quilts were layered thick, socks were knitted from wool, and coats were lined with fur when available. Children often wore garments passed down from older siblings, stitched and restitched until the fabric nearly gave way. Mittens and scarves were fashioned from scraps, for even the smallest piece of fabric had value when winter winds arrived. Houses, too, were made ready for the cold. Sod walls were patched with fresh blocks of earth, filling cracks that might let in drafts. Roofs were checked and repaired, sometimes reinforced with more sod or straw to keep out snow. Windows, when present, were covered with oiled paper or cloth to hold in heat. Families who owned log cabins often stuffed moss or rags between the logs, sealing gaps against the wind. Though simple, these repairs could mean the difference between comfort and misery when storms pressed against the walls. Livestock required special care. Cows, horses, and pigs were driven into barns or makeshift shelters, where hay was stacked high to provide feed. Chickens were kept close to homes, their coops reinforced against the cold. Every animal represented not only immediate survival but also future livelihood. A cow meant milk, a horse meant plowing and transport, a pig meant food for spring. Protecting these animals was as urgent as protecting one's own family. Water, often taken for granted in summer, also became part of the preparation. Wells were dug deep and barrels were filled before the freeze set in. Families near rivers sometimes hauled extra water to store in wooden tubs. When streams froze solid, these reserves became essential. Snow could be melted, but it consumed precious fuel, a resource too valuable to waste. The psychological preparation for winter was just as important as the physical. Families knew that once storms began, isolation would follow. Travel to neighbors might become impossible, and weeks could pass without visitors. To prepare for these long nights, families stocked books, Bibles, and simple amusements. Children whittled toys, women prepared handwork to pass the hours, and men repaired tools. Storytelling became a form of preparation too, gathering memories and tales to carry spirits through the monotony of winter. Community also played a role in preparation. Neighbors sometimes gathered to help one another with large tasks, building barns, cutting wood, or raising fences. These acts of cooperation were not only practical but also symbolic, reminders that even in the vast loneliness of the plains, no family was entirely alone. The bonds formed in autumn often proved life-saving in January, when emergencies arose. As the days shortened and the air grew colder, the urgency of preparation deepened. The sound of geese flying south, the scent of wood smoke in the air, the frost settling on fields, these were signals that time was nearly gone. Families worked from dawn until dusk, storing every possible supply, patching every weakness, and offering prayers for the months ahead. Despite all their efforts, pioneers knew that preparation could never be perfect. A sudden storm, an illness, or the loss of livestock could undo even the most careful planning. Yet preparation was more than a necessity, it was a ritual, a way of asserting control over an uncertain future. In every jar sealed, in every log stacked, in every quilt stitched, there was hope. Hope that spring would return, hope that their labor would carry them through, hope that survival was possible on this vast and challenging land. As autumn gave way to winter, the settlers faced what they had prepared for. Some entered the season with full stores, warm homes, and strong spirits. Others, less fortunate, faced shortages from the start. Yet all shared the same reality. Once the snow fell, the land would no longer provide. Whatever they had gathered was all they would have, until the thaw of spring. Thus, preparing for winter was not only about survival. It was about resilience, foresight, and faith. Each family, whether in a humble soddy or a sturdier cabin, faced the season with what they had managed to gather, and with the determination to endure. The work of preparation was done. Now the waiting, and the true test of survival, would begin. When the first snows fell across the Great Plains, a profound stillness settled over the land. Fields once alive with movement grew silent, blanketed in white. The winds grew sharper, colder, and the horizon disappeared into a blur of ice and cloud. For the pioneers, this marked the true beginning of winter, the long season of endurance that would test every ounce of strength and patience they had gathered during the warmer months. At first, winter arrived quietly. Frost crept across windows, water buckets froze overnight, and the air grew heavy with the promise of snow. But soon the storms came, sweeping across the open prairie with sudden violence. Blizzards could last for hours, sometimes days, leaving families trapped inside their homes. Snow piled against doors and windows, sealing cabins in darkness. Even simple tasks, feeding animals, gathering fuel, checking on neighbors, became dangerous journeys through the blinding white. The cold itself was an enemy. Without mountains or forests to break the wind, the chill moved freely across the plains, cutting through clothing and stinging exposed skin. Frostbite was common. To step outside without sufficient protection was to risk losing fingers, toes, or even one's life. Children were kept indoors, wrapped in quilts, while adults ventured out only when absolutely necessary. The cold did not simply press against the walls. It crept inside, settling into bones and lingering in the air even around the hearth. Fuel supplies, carefully gathered in autumn, were consumed faster than expected. Fires had to be kept burning day and night, for once the warmth faded, the damp walls of sod houses quickly grew icy. Families rationed their fuel, choosing carefully when to burn wood, when to use buffalo chips, and when to endure the cold rather than spend precious reserves. Nights were particularly difficult. With the fire burning low, families huddled together under quilts, sharing body heat, listening to the wind press against the house like a living thing. Food, too, became a source of anxiety. At the beginning of winter, pantries and cellars were full, but as the weeks passed, supplies dwindled. Potatoes grew soft, meat supplies shrank, and jars of preserved food were carefully rationed. Meals became smaller, simpler. A pot of stew might be stretched across several days, each serving thinner than the last. For children, hunger was especially hard, their young bodies craving food while parents struggled to provide. Families often spoke of making do, a phrase that carried both resignation and quiet strength. Isolation weighed heavily on the spirit. Storms cut off travel, and even in calmer weather, the distances between homesteads were vast. Weeks could pass without visitors, without news, without the comfort of another voice. Letters from the east, when they arrived, brought joy but also sorrow, reminders of loved ones far away, of homes left behind. Loneliness pressed against families as surely as the cold. In the silence of winter nights, with only the wind outside, it was easy to feel forgotten by the wider world. Illness added another layer of hardship. Colds and fevers spread quickly in the cramped, poorly ventilated rooms of sod houses. With little access to doctors, families relied on home remedies, herbal teas, and rest. Infections that might have been minor in other circumstances became dangerous in winter's isolation. The loss of even one family member could tip the balance of survival, leaving work undone and spirits broken. Parents worried constantly for their children, whose small bodies were less able to fight off sickness. Animals too suffered. Cattle grew thin, chickens stopped laying, and horses weakened in the cold. Feeding them required endless effort, as hay supplies dwindled and frozen water had to be broken daily. Losing livestock was a heavy blow, not only for the immediate winter but for the survival of the next season's farming. Families watched their animals carefully, knowing that their own future depended on their survival. The storms themselves were perhaps the most frightening of all hardships. Pioneers spoke of blizzards that came suddenly, turning clear skies into walls of snow. Visibility dropped to nothing, and the world became a swirl of white. Stories tell of men lost within yards of their homes, wandering in circles until the cold overtook them. To combat this, settlers tied ropes from their doors to their barns, lifelines that guided them through the storm. Even with such precautions, stepping outside was a risk, and many chose instead to wait, listening as the wind howled for hours on end. Monotony became another quiet challenge. Days blended into nights, each one much the same as the last. Families passed the hours with chores, mending clothes, or telling stories, but the sameness of the days wore on the mind. Children grew restless, while adults bore the weight of keeping spirits lifted. Winter seemed endless, and the slow march of time was as heavy as the storms themselves. Despite all this, small comforts made survival bearable. The crackle of a fire, the warmth of a shared meal, the sound of hymns sung softly at night. These moments reminded families of their resilience. Even in the harshest conditions, laughter sometimes echoed in sod houses, born from games, songs, or stories. These fragile joys were not luxuries, they were lifelines keeping despair at bay through the darkest months. Yet not every story was one of endurance. Some families did not survive. Illness claimed lives. Storms stranded travelers. Supplies ran out. These losses were deeply felt, not only by families but by entire communities. A neighbor's death was a sobering reminder of how precarious survival truly was. The Great Plains offered little forgiveness, and each winter left behind its own stories of both resilience and tragedy. By the time February gave way to March, families were weary. Supplies were thin, bodies were tired, and spirits were stretched to their limits. But even in this exhaustion there was a quiet strength. Each day survived was a victory. Each morning's light was a reminder that the worst could not last forever. The pioneers endured, not through comfort or ease, but through persistence, an unyielding refusal to surrender to the cold. The reality of winter hardships then was not a single struggle but a tapestry of challenges. Hunger, cold, loneliness, illness, and fear. And yet, woven through these hardships was resilience. Families endured because they must, because to give up was to lose everything. Their survival was not grand or dramatic, but quiet, steady, and determined. As the storms slowly loosened their grip, the settlers emerged from winter changed. They had endured nights of fear, days of hunger, and weeks of solitude. The reality of the Great Plains winter had tested them in every way. But with survival came a new strength, a deeper understanding of both the land and themselves. And as the snow began to melt, they looked toward spring not only with relief but with renewed hope. Although the winters on the Great Plains often confined families to their homes, survival was rarely a solitary effort. Behind the image of isolated sod houses scattered across a frozen prairie lay a quieter truth. Pioneers endured because they leaned on one another. Community, though fragile and distant, was a lifeline. It provided both practical support and emotional comfort, softening the edge of hardship with the warmth of human connection. Neighbors were often miles apart, yet they were bound by necessity. When a barn needed building, when a family fell ill, or when food supplies ran low, settlers relied on each other. Cooperation was not a matter of choice but of survival. Alone, a family might falter. Together they had a chance. The very act of reaching across the snow-covered plains to a neighbor represented an affirmation of shared resilience. One of the most common forms of cooperation was the barn raising. These events, often held before winter but remembered during it, symbolized the power of community. Men gathered to lift timbers, women prepared meals, and children played nearby. The work was heavy, but the laughter and companionship made it bearable. In the months that followed, that barn stood not just as a shelter for animals, but as a monument to shared labor. During winter storms, families took comfort in knowing their animals were safe because neighbors had helped provide that safety. Food too was shared. A family with a surplus of potatoes might exchange with a neighbor who had extra meat. Canned goods, dried beans, or loaves of bread sometimes found their way across frozen fields, carried carefully in baskets or sleds. Such exchanges were not transactions of wealth but gestures of solidarity. To give food was to extend hope, a reminder that no one was entirely alone in the wilderness. Emergencies often revealed the strength of these bonds. When illness struck, neighbors traveled through snow and wind to offer aid. Women acted as midwives during childbirth, while men rode miles to fetch medicine or a doctor when one was available. These journeys were dangerous, but they were undertaken without hesitation, for to ignore a neighbor in need was unthinkable. Survival was a shared responsibility, carried on many shoulders. Spiritual life also wove communities together. Even in winter, settlers gathered when they could for worship. Sometimes this meant a small group assembled in a sod house, singing hymns softly by firelight. Other times, it meant a traveling preacher visiting and holding service in a barn or cabin. Faith gave people a sense of unity that transcended distance. The words of Scripture, spoken aloud in the stillness of winter, reminded families that their struggles were not born alone but were part of a greater story. Children felt the benefits of community most deeply. In lonely sod houses, their playmates were often siblings only. But when neighbors gathered, whether for work or worship, children found joy in games, laughter, and the simple delight of companionship. Their voices, high and clear in the frosty air, carried a reminder that even in hardship, life contained moments of innocence and joy. Women, too, found solace in community. Quilting bees brought them together, offering both practical warmth and emotional relief. As hands stitched fabric into patterns, voices shared stories, advice, and encouragement. Quilts created in these gatherings were more than blankets. They were symbols of collective care, every stitch a bond between women who knew the trials of isolation and the strength of fellowship. Winter also brought opportunities for storytelling. Families visited one another when the weather allowed, carrying tales from far and near. Stories of journeys west, of ancestors back east, or of neighbors' fortunes and misfortunes spread across the plains like threads weaving a larger tapestry. In a world where news traveled slowly, storytelling connected communities, making the vast distances feel a little smaller. In some cases, cooperation extended beyond daily survival to acts of rescue. When storms stranded travelers, neighbors braved the snow to search for them, guided only by instinct and the faint hope of success. When barns collapsed under heavy snow, communities came together to rebuild. These acts of bravery and compassion were remembered long after the winter passed, told and retold as testaments to the strength of unity. Even in death, communities leaned on each other. Funerals, though somber, brought neighbors together to mourn, to support grieving families, and to affirm life's continuity. In the starkness of winter, when loss seemed especially heavy, the presence of others offered a measure of comfort. To stand together, even in sorrow, was itself an act of resilience. The pioneers learned that cooperation was not only practical, it was deeply human. Isolation bred despair, but community sparked hope. The laughter of a neighbor, the shared warmth of a quilt, the helping hand during a storm. These moments reminded settlers that survival was not measured only in food or fuel but in fellowship. As the winters wore on, traditions of cooperation became embedded in pioneer culture. Children grew up understanding that to help a neighbor was as natural as breathing. Adults recognized that their own survival depended on the strength of others. These values carried forward, shaping not only individual families but the broader character of the American West. It is easy, when imagining the Great Plains, to see only the endless horizon and the solitary figure of a sod house against the snow. But the truer picture includes the invisible bonds between families, the unseen network of care and compassion that stretched across miles. Winter might have been endured within walls, but it was survived because of neighbors. The story of community and cooperation, then, is a story of quiet strength. It is not marked by great battles or grand victories, but by simple acts: a loaf of bread shared, a barn built, a prayer spoken in unison. These acts, though small, built resilience as surely as any wall of sod or store of firewood. And as spring approached, families looked back on the winter not only with relief, but with gratitude, for their neighbors, their friends, and the unspoken understanding that on the Great Plains, survival was never a solitary task. It was a shared journey, walked together across the frozen land, step by step, through storms and silence, until the thaw of spring returned life to the prairie once more. In the stillness of the long prairie nights, when the wind rattled sod walls and the fire burned low, pioneers turned inward for strength. Food and fuel kept bodies alive, but faith and spirit carried the heart. On the Great Plains, where winters could strip away all sense of comfort and certainty, belief, whether in God, in tradition, or in the quiet endurance of the human spirit, was a lifeline as vital as any supply stored for the season. Religion was at the center of many pioneer households. The family Bible often held a place of honor, its pages worn and softened by use, its words a constant source of reassurance. By firelight, fathers read aloud familiar passages, while mothers led hymns in voices steady and low. Children listened, drowsy beneath quilts, as scripture filled the darkness with meaning. For families who felt forgotten by the wider world, these readings reminded them that they were part of a larger story, one in which endurance had value and suffering carried purpose. On Sundays, even when storms raged outside, many families sought to keep the Sabbath. Some gathered in small groups, traveling through the snow to a neighbor's sod house where worship would be held. Others stayed at home, setting aside chores for prayer and quiet reflection. The words of hymns sung softly into the cold air seemed to linger, rising above the winds as acts of defiance and hope. Worship was not merely a ritual, it was a way of saying that winter could not steal their spirit. Faith took many forms. For some, it was rooted in deep Protestant traditions brought from the East. For others, it was shaped by Catholic practices, folk beliefs, or the customs of immigrant communities from Europe. Each family carried pieces of their past with them, weaving them into daily life on the plains. These traditions gave structure to time, turning endless winter days into rhythms marked by prayer, storytelling, and song. Beyond religion, the spirit of survival also thrived in stories. Evenings around the fire were often filled with tales, of ancestors back home, of journeys across the ocean, of hardships already overcome. Parents told children stories of bravery and endurance, teaching them that struggle was not new and that others before them had survived worse. In this way, storytelling became both entertainment and instruction, planting courage where fear might otherwise take root. Superstitions and folk traditions also played their part. Some families hung charms, carried from the old country, to ward off illness or bad fortune. Others practiced rituals passed down through generations, blending practicality with belief. Whether these customs truly influenced survival mattered less than the comfort they brought. In times of uncertainty, even small rituals carried weight, grounding families in continuity and tradition. Music was another balm for the spirit. Hymns, folk songs, and lullabies filled the air during long evenings. A fiddle, if one was available, could transform a night of monotony into an evening of warmth and joy. Voices raised in harmony, even softly, lifted hearts. Songs were shared across cultures and languages, carrying echoes of distant homelands into the present moment. The act of singing together reminded families that they were not alone, but part of a chain of endurance stretching across time and place. For children, faith and spirit offered comfort against fear. The howling of the wind, the darkness of endless nights, the stories of neighbors lost to storms, all could weigh heavily on young minds. Yet the steady reassurance of parents, the repetition of prayers, and the rituals of bedtime hymns wrapped children in a sense of safety. They might still tremble at the storm outside, but within the walls of faith they found peace. Adults, too, leaned on faith when hope seemed thin. A failed harvest, a dwindling supply of food, or the sickness of a child could easily crush morale. Yet belief in God's providence, or in the simple conviction that spring would return, helped settlers face each day. Faith did not erase hardship, but it reframed it, offering meaning in place of despair. In moments of deep crisis, communities often turned to collective prayer. Neighbors gathered, sometimes by torchlight in the snow, to plead together for relief or to give thanks for survival. These gatherings, fragile and brief, carried immense power. They reminded settlers that faith was not only personal but shared, that hope multiplied when it was voiced together. Yet faith was not always solemn. It often found expression in humor, in lightheartedness, in the quiet confidence that hardship could be endured. Families laughed at small mistakes, told funny stories, and found ways to smile even when cupboards were bare. This too was a kind of faith, a belief in the power of spirit to withstand suffering. As winter stretched on, faith and spirit became threads binding life together. They did not provide food or fuel, yet they offered resilience in equal measure. To light a candle and pray, to sing a hymn into the night, to tell a child a story of courage, these acts sustained hearts as surely as any meal. By spring, families often looked back and recognized that faith had been as crucial as firewood or salted meat. It had given them strength when their bodies were weary, comfort when their homes felt too small, and hope when the horizon seemed endless with snow. The Great Plains had demanded everything of them, yet in return, it revealed the depth of their spirit. The role of faith and spirit, then, was not an afterthought of survival, it was its foundation. Without it, the cold could break hearts as easily as it froze rivers. With it, even the harshest winter became endurable. Faith gave settlers not only the will to survive but also the quiet courage to keep dreaming of spring, of green fields, and of lives rebuilt when the snow melted at last. The story of the Great Plains winters cannot be fully understood through facts and descriptions alone. It comes alive most vividly in the quiet accounts left behind by the men, women, and children who endured them. Their letters, diaries, and memories carry the weight of lived experience. Moments of resilience, moments of sorrow, and the countless small decisions that determined whether a family survived the long season or fell to its hardships. These stories, though separated by time, allow us to step gently into their world, to see the winter through their eyes, and to hear the echoes of both survival and loss. One of the most striking stories comes from Nebraska, where a young couple arrived in the late 1860s to claim land under the Homestead Act. They built a sod house, rough and plain, and filled their cellar with what food they could gather before the snow. But they had underestimated the severity of the winter. As the weeks wore on, their supplies dwindled. They learned to make meals from whatever was left, thin stews of beans, bread stretched with cornmeal, and occasionally a rabbit caught near the house. Their letters from that winter speak of hunger but also of hope. The husband wrote that each sunrise felt like a small triumph. When spring finally came, they were exhausted, their cellar empty, but their faith in survival renewed. They would go on to live many more years on that homestead, always remembering that first winter as their hardest and most binding test. Another account, this one from Kansas, tells of a widow with 3 young children. Her husband had died only months before the first snow. Left with little food and no animals to provide milk or meat, her situation was desperate. Yet neighbors rallied around her. One man brought potatoes from his storehouse, another shared firewood, and women from nearby farms stitched extra quilts. Together, these gifts sustained the family. Later, the widow would say that she had not survived the winter alone but had been carried through by the generosity of others. Her story stands as a reminder that community was as vital as any personal preparation. But there were tragedies as well, moments when even the strongest preparation and the deepest faith could not shield families from loss. In Dakota Territory, a man was caught in a blizzard less than 100 yards from his cabin. The storm was so fierce that he could not see the rope stretched between the barn and his home. Disoriented, he wandered in circles until the cold overtook him. His family found his body when the storm lifted, only steps from the safety of his door. Stories like his became cautionary lessons, passed down from one generation to the next. Never underestimate the power of the prairie storms. Illness claimed many lives during these winters. In one family's journal from Iowa, a mother described how diphtheria swept through their household. 3 children grew ill within days. With no doctor available, she and her husband relied on home remedies, prayers, and sleepless nights at their bedside. 2 children recovered. The youngest did not. The mother's writing carries both grief and quiet acceptance. She spoke of laying her child to rest in frozen ground, comforted only by the hope that spring would bring healing to the rest of her family. Her story reflects the fragility of pioneer life, where the smallest illness could become a tragedy. Yet, alongside sorrow, there were stories of endurance that almost seem miraculous. In South Dakota, a boy wandered away from his family's homestead during a snowstorm, chasing after a cow that had strayed. When hours passed and he did not return, the family feared he was lost. Neighbors joined the search, braving the blinding snow, calling his name through the wind. At last they found him huddled against a haystack, shivering but alive. He had used the hay to block the wind and keep himself warm. His survival was celebrated not only by his family but by the entire community. The story was told for years afterward as a symbol of hope, of what could be endured even in the harshest storms. Other accounts speak of women who held their families together through sheer determination. One pioneer wife in Minnesota spent an entire winter alone with her children while her husband traveled east to buy supplies. She chopped wood, hauled water, cared for livestock, and comforted her children through long, stormy nights. In her later years, she admitted that fear was her constant companion, But she also spoke of the pride she felt when spring finally came and she had endured. Her story reminds us that survival was not always the work of men alone, but of women whose strength sustained entire households. Loneliness was itself a hardship, and many settlers recorded the toll it took. A young woman from Missouri, newly married and brought west to a homestead in Kansas, wrote of the silence that surrounded her. Weeks passed without visitors, and she longed for the company of her family back east. In her diary, she confessed that sometimes she wept simply to hear her own voice. Yet she also described how she turned to prayer, song, and journaling as ways of keeping her spirit alive. Her words reflect a truth often overlooked. Survival was not only about enduring the physical cold, but also about finding ways to preserve the warmth of the soul. There are also stories of quiet sacrifice. In one account, a father gave up his portion of food so his children might eat. For weeks he survived on little more than broth, his body growing weaker as the children grew stronger. When spring arrived, he was frail but alive, and his children would always remember his unspoken sacrifice. These small acts of love, repeated countless times across the plains, reveal the depth of commitment families had to one another. Not every loss was met with despair. Some families chose to see tragedy as part of a larger story of endurance. In letters written after a devastating winter, one settler spoke of losing both crops and livestock, yet wrote with quiet faith that the land would give again in time. "The snow has taken much," he wrote, "but the spring will return and so shall we." His words capture the pioneer's spirit, a refusal to surrender even when faced with profound loss. Together, these stories of survival and loss reveal the complexity of life on the Great Plains. They remind us that history is not made only of victories, but also of struggles, sacrifices, and sorrows. Survival was never guaranteed, yet families endured through faith, community, and resilience. Loss was always near, yet it was met with quiet courage. The winters of the Great Plains tested every family who lived there. For some, the test ended in sorrow. For others, it forged bonds of strength that lasted a lifetime. The stories we inherit, whether of hunger endured, storms survived, or loved ones lost, form a tapestry of human experience that continues to inspire. To listen to these accounts is to understand that survival was not measured only in terms of food and shelter, but in the ability to hope, to love, and to endure. Each family carried its own story, woven into the larger history of the West. And though many of their names are forgotten, their resilience remains, echoing across the prairie winds, whispering of both survival and loss. After months of silence, cold, and waiting, change came slowly to the Great Plains. At first, it was only a whisper, snow melting in shallow drifts, water dripping softly from the eaves of sod houses, the faint smell of damp earth rising into the air. The world that had been locked in ice for so long began to stir, cautiously, as if testing the promise of renewal. For the pioneers who had endured the long winter, these signs carried a weight far greater than their simplicity. They were signals of survival, proof that spring had returned, and with it, the chance to begin again. The transition from winter to spring was never sudden. March often brought more storms, fierce winds that reminded settlers of the season's lingering power. Yet even these storms felt different. Snow no longer piled endlessly, but melted more quickly, leaving muddy ground in its wake. The air softened, carrying with it the faint warmth of the sun. Families stepped outside more often, their eyes adjusting once more to the wide horizon that stretched beyond their doors. One of the earliest signs of change was the sound of water. Streams that had been frozen solid began to crack and flow. Wells, once difficult to draw from, yielded more easily. Children listened with wonder to the gurgling of creeks, a sound that promised abundance after scarcity. Water meant life, life for crops, livestock, and people alike. It was the first assurance that the land, so harsh in winter, would soon provide again. Animals, too, signaled the coming of spring. Chickens began to lay eggs more regularly. Cattle grew stronger as grazing returned. Birds, absent through the coldest months, reappeared in the skies, their calls bright against the lingering quiet. Geese flew overhead, their V-shaped formations pointing north, as if guiding the pioneers toward the warmth that lay ahead. These natural rhythms reminded families that survival was not only human, it was part of the larger cycle of the plains. For the settlers, spring also meant freedom. No longer confined by snowdrifts and storms, they could once again travel, visit neighbors, and rebuild the connections strained by months of isolation. The first visits of spring were often filled with relief and gratitude. Neighbors exchanged stories of how they had endured, spoke of losses and triumphs, and shared what little they had left. These gatherings were more than social. They were celebrations of survival, acknowledgments that they had faced the worst and had come through together. Work returned quickly. Fields that had lain dormant beneath snow were plowed and prepared for planting. Men guided heavy blades through the thawing earth, while women planted seeds saved from the previous harvest. Children scattered to help with chores, their laughter filling the air once more. The rhythm of labor felt welcome after months of idleness. Every furrow turned, every seed planted was an act of hope, a declaration that life would continue. The return of green to the prairie was perhaps the most powerful symbol of all. Grass pushed up through the soil, painting the horizon with soft color. Wildflowers appeared, dotting the fields with delicate blossoms. After months of white and gray, the sight of green fields lifted spirits in ways words could scarcely describe. Settlers often paused in their work to simply look at the land, grateful for its renewal. Yet spring brought challenges of its own. Floods from melting snow sometimes washed across fields. Mud made travel difficult, slowing wagons and bogging down animals. Illness often spread as bodies, weakened by months of scarcity, struggled to adjust to the changing season. But even with these hardships, spring was welcomed. Its difficulties were the difficulties of life, not of near starvation and cold. They were struggles that could be worked through, rather than endured in silence. The emotional relief of spring was as significant as the physical. Families who had spent nights fearing they might not last another week now found themselves planning again, planning crops, births, and futures. The simple act of hearing birdsong or feeling sunlight on their faces restored energy and optimism. Parents smiled more often. Children played freely outdoors. Even the elders, weary from another harsh season, found comfort in the renewal of life around them. For many pioneers, spring also carried a sense of gratitude. Prayers of thanksgiving were offered, hymns were sung with new fervor, and journals recorded words of relief. Survival was never taken for granted. Each spring felt like a gift, a chance to begin again on land that demanded much but also gave much in return. Communities often marked the arrival of spring with gatherings. Church services grew in number, social events like barn dances or quilting circles resumed, and neighbors visited more freely. These events were not extravagant, but they carried deep meaning. To dance in a barn lit by lanterns, to share a meal with friends, to sing hymns and voices strong with renewed hope. These moments reminded settlers that they had not only endured winter but had entered a new season together. Children especially embraced the change. After being confined indoors for so long, they ran across muddy fields, splashed in puddles and chased one another beneath open skies. Their laughter was a symbol of the future, a reminder that life on the plains was not only about survival, but about the possibility of joy. In many ways, the transition to spring revealed the true rhythm of pioneer life. Hardship and renewal were woven together, each giving meaning to the other. Without the trials of winter, the joy of spring would not have carried the same weight. Without the silence of snow, the song of birds would not have sounded so sweet. Survival was not an end in itself, but a bridge to these moments of renewal. As families looked out over their fields, preparing once more for the cycle of planting and harvest, they carried with them the memory of the winter just past. They remembered the nights of fear, the meals stretched thin, the storms that pressed against their homes. But they also remembered the laughter around the fire, the hymns sung in darkness, and the strength found in neighbors. These memories became part of their identity, shaping how they saw themselves and the land they had chosen to call home. The Great Plains were never easy. Each winter tested settlers in ways few had anticipated. Yet each spring reminded them why they had come, to claim a life, to raise families, to carve out a future in a land both harsh and beautiful. The transition from winter to spring was more than a change of season. It was a reminder that life could endure, that hope could return, and that the human spirit, though tested, could find renewal in the turning of the year. As we come to the end of our journey across the Great Plains, we find ourselves reflecting on more than the history of winters long past. We reflect on the people who lived them, families who left behind familiar homes, traveled into uncertainty, and built lives in a land that was both beautiful and unforgiving. Their story is not one of grandeur or conquest. It is a story written in quiet perseverance, in nights spent around fires, in days filled with labor, and in the steady rhythm of endurance. The winters of the Great Plains stripped life down to its essentials. Food, warmth, shelter, and companionship became the only things that mattered. For pioneers, survival was not measured in comfort but in the ability to keep going, one day at a time. Each snowstorm endured, each meal stretched, each morning greeted was its own victory. In these small, steady steps, families discovered the depth of their resilience. We have seen how they prepared in autumn, storing food, gathering fuel, and stitching quilts to guard against the cold. We have walked with them through the harshness of winter, through blizzards that erased the horizon, through hunger that gnawed at their strength, and through illnesses that tested their hope. We have felt the relief of spring, when the snow finally melted and the land once more promised life. And through it all, we have listened to their voices, their stories of survival, their moments of loss, their acts of kindness that bound communities together. The pioneers did not tame the land so much as they learned to live within its rhythms. The Great Plains taught them humility. It reminded them that human strength alone was not enough, that survival depended on faith, cooperation, and respect for the cycles of nature. They endured not because they conquered winter, but because they adapted to it, leaning on one another and on the quiet conviction that spring would always return. In their resilience, we glimpse something universal. Though our lives today are far removed from sod houses and frozen wells, the essence of their struggle still speaks to us. We too face seasons of difficulty, times when hope feels thin, when challenges press against us like winter winds. The pioneers remind us that endurance is not found in dramatic triumphs but in steady faith, in patience, and in the small acts of care we give to one another. Their story also reminds us of the power of community. Alone, the winters might have been unbearable. Together, families shared food, rebuilt barns, and rescued one another from storms. These acts of fellowship were as essential to survival as fire or food. They speak to a truth that stretches beyond time and place, that human beings are not meant to endure life's hardships in isolation, but in connection. As we close, picture once more the sod house on a winter night. The wind presses against the walls, snow gathers at the door, and the land outside is silent. Inside, however, the fire glows softly. A family gathers close, wrapped in quilts, whispering prayers, telling stories, or singing hymns. Their lives are fragile, their hardships real, yet within that humble space burns a spirit that refuses to be extinguished. That spirit, the spirit of resilience, of faith, of quiet courage, is the true legacy of the pioneers. And so, the question we began with, how did pioneers survive the harsh winters on the Great Plains, finds its answer not in a single explanation, but in a collection of truths. They survived through preparation, through adaptation, through community, through faith, and through the simple determination to endure. Their survival was not easy and many did not make it through. But those who did carried forward not only their lives but their lessons that shaped the history of the American West. Tonight, as we reflect on their journey, we are reminded of the strength that lies quietly within the human heart. The pioneers teach us that even in the harshest winters, whether of land or of life, there is a way forward. It may be slow, it may be quiet, but it endures step by step, day by day until spring returns. And with that thought, we bring this story to a gentle close. The winds of the prairie fade, the fires burn low, and the voices of the pioneers rest once more in memory. Their story lingers not as noise, but as a calm reminder of resilience, endurance, and hope.